Hello and welcome to another episode of Soberanía, the Mexican Politics Podcast. I'm your co-host, Jose Luis Granado Ceja, Mexican-born journalist living and working here in Mexico City, freelance writer and staff writer over at Venezuela Analysis, as well as host of their podcast. And as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Kurt Hackbarth. Kurt, how you doing? Welcome.
Doing very well, Jose Luis. Thank you very much. My name is Kurt Hackbarth, writing for Jacobin Magazine in the United States and Sentido Común here in Mexico, ready for another episode of, wait for it, Soberanía.
You got it. It's good to be back. It's good to be keeping up with the news. As always, there's lots happening. This week, we're going to be talking about this debate that's happening in Mexico City around overrepresentation. Basically boils down to an effort by the opposition trying to once again achieve what it couldn't achieve at the ballot box via judicial, legal, sneaky maneuvers. We're talking about the PAN revealing its true colors and admitting that they never supported social programs in the first place. An embarrassing tweet by a libertarian right-wing commentator, so-called journalist Sergio Sarmiento, who totally doesn't understand what's actually happening in the country when it comes to trust in media. And maybe that's why he's so unable to. He's just out of touch. And of course, finally, we're going to go to our losers and haters. We want to mention this at the beginning, so stick around till the end because we're going to visit our old friend Tim Golden at ProPublica. This show started by breaking down some of his lies very early on. So maybe some of you who joined us recently, check out our old episodes. We get into the whole story of how even progressive media outlets are making grave mistakes when it comes to their coverage of Mexico. And, in fact, Kurt, you had said, what happened to Tim Golden? Well, we got an answer. So we're going to break that down for you. Stick around to the end. But like I said, first topic on the show today is going to be this discussion about overrepresentation. What does that mean? What are they trying to get at? What's the discussion happening there? Obviously related to Morena's landslide victory in the June 2nd election that saw them win a supermajority, a qualified majority, as sometimes called in English, in the lower house of Congress and coming very, very, very close in the Senate. So close that it's likely not going to be a barrier to them advancing their constitutional reforms. But now we see it's a full court press, to use a sports metaphor there, against this very legitimate result. It looks like they're trying to change the result. And so what we saw recently, just last week, was the Interior Secretary, Luisa Maria Alcalde, used to be Labor Secretary, going on the Mañanera and talking about what is the government's take on this? What is their view? Is there actually a case of the Constitution being violated, electoral laws being violated? We're going to get into the nitty-gritty of it here with Kurt, but I wanted to paint the picture for you and make this comment as well. I mean, in the past, not having the Mañanera would have meant that the discussion would have entirely been focused on what, the talking heads, the pundits, the news presenters would have to say about this. They would frame the narrative in a very confusingly deceptive way, trying to make it seem like, oh no, what Morena's doing is actually violating the Constitution. There would be no pushback. But now we have the Mañanera, and I think it's really important to highlight that there are voices that can answer that narrative, to go against that narrative, and actually present a different perspective. What I agree with, what I would say is actually the correct analysis, interpretation of what the law is actually saying. And I think that's why they hate the Mañanera. And good news, Claudia Sheinbaum has confirmed that she will do a Mañanera, one form or another. It's probably not going to be exactly the same. She's kind of mentioned that they're kind of working out what it's going to look like, what the program is actually going to be, how long it's going to run, et cetera, et cetera. But the good news is that that's not disappearing, and I think that's really important. The fact that we have the opportunity to hear directly from the Interior Minister, Secretaria de Gobernación, talking about this issue, giving that legal analysis. But we're fortunate to have this image as well here, which kind of breaks it down in really simple terms. I'll hand it over to you, Kurt. That was just a very broad kind of introduction to what this debate is, but let's get into the details of it. Why is this important? It's been the topic of conversation all week.
Sure. So just before we start, it's really important that you mentioned that this came out in the Mañanera, and I've got a new piece up in Jacobin that just came out on Sunday, which does a deep dive into how Morena has managed in very adverse international circumstances to win 2 landslides in a row, the second even bigger than the first. And one of the linchpins of that is the Mañanera. So if you want some
we'll
kind
put
of
that in the description below. People check out that article.
Below this video, right? So As exactly as Jose Luis said in the intro, as we've been predicting for months, the opposition, knowing that they were going to lose the election, was always going to try to shift the real fight to the post-electoral arena. So we saw this on election night when Xochitl Gálvez said that she wasn't going to accept the results, and then she called Claudia Sheinbaum to concede, and then said again that she wasn't accepting the results and she was going to contest the results. But when she was cited to go and present her evidence, didn't show up, right? She bailed out, right? And so then you've had these rulings from the preliminary rulings from the Electoral Tribunal that two of López Obrador's mañaneras in 2023 supposedly violated the equitabilidad, the balance of the election, but that, is not in itself enough to change anything. So what they're really going for now is what they call the overrepresentation. Now, we've talked about this previously on the program, so I don't want to repeat myself and I don't want to go too far into the weeds. But basically, Mexico has a mixed system of representation, right? Some seats are elected by single-member districts, as in the United States or the UK, but some other seats are assigned by proportional representation, right? There's a series of reforms since the 70s to try to get more minority party representation into Congress. In the case of the House of Deputies, there are 300 single-member seats and 200 proportional representation seats to make up 500 in total, right? Now, the Constitution in Article 54 sets a limit to what's called the overrepresentation. That is, the number of seats your party wins by single-member districts and the number of seats your party wins by proportional representation cannot exceed 8% of your total vote, okay? So as I've mentioned previously, this is not like a top-up system, like in Germany, where the PR seats top up your single-member seats so that they can get right to where the national vote is. That's not the Mexican system. The Mexican system adds the single-member seats you win to the PR seats you win, and when you add them together, the total cannot exceed 8% of what's called overrepresentation, right? This was a deliberate clause added by the previous regime to give themselves basically a majority bonus or to allow for governability, in quotes, right? This was deliberately, put in by the old regime, right? So, that's there. That's in the Constitution. The Constitution is very clear that this refers to parties, right? Then, as we see here in the tweet by Jesus Ramirez Cuevas, right, the presidential spokesperson, right, the overrepresentation was proposed by the PRI and the PAN in 1996, right? But then there was an attempt to have that overrepresentation not refer to individual parties, but to coalitions, right? So instead of saying each individual party can have an 8% overrepresentation, it would apply to the coalition itself. So if Moreno is in coalition with two other parties, right, it wouldn't be 8% overrepresentation for each party, but for the coalition as a whole, right? But if we go to these slides here, if we want to pull those up, let's go to the first one, and I'll narrate for those who are listening on Spotify and Apple Podcast, right? So this was clear in the 1996 reform, right? That it was a political party, right? But then subsequently they changed the what's called the COFIPE, the Federal Code of Institutions and of Electoral Institutions and Procedures, to try to get it to apply only to coalitions. If we go to the next slide here, that attempt to have it apply to coalitions was eliminated in the 2008 electoral reform after the election of 2006 and all of the the contested election and the fraud there. Who eliminated it? Who eliminated it? Well, it shows right there on the screen. The PAN, the PRI, and the Green Party, right? They eliminated the regulation that said that the overrepresentation would apply to the coalition and not the party. So every single election since 2008, seats have been assigned with the overrepresentation by party and not by coalition, right? Every single one. The election of 2009, 2012, 2015, 2018, 21, 24, right? All of them. And actually, as Tamaris Greco points out, the journalist Tamaris Greco in Milenio, the subsequent electoral reform of 2014 went even further. First they took the regulation out of the COFIPE in 2008, but the 2014 electoral reform passed in the era of the Pact from Mexico, when the PRI was conniving with the PAN and the PRD to pass a series of neoliberal reforms, amongst them the privatization, the part privatization of Pemex. They eliminated the coalition clause again, right? Not just in the COFIPE, but in electoral law itself. So it is supremely ironic that you have the opposition now, the PRI and the PAN and the PRD, crying about overrepresentation. Look, here's the slide on the screen that shows you how every election since 2009, the seats have been assigned by party and not coalition. So you have the opposition crying about the fact that the Morena coalition is benefiting from the overrepresentation law when they were the ones who got rid of it not once, but twice, in 2008 and again in 2014. They got rid of it. They got rid of it because they saw this great moment to create this great Pact from Mexico coalition in which they would govern eternally and just pass the ball back and forth between the PRI and the PAN and benefit from this very clause, this governability clause, this majority bonus, right? And now they're crying because they shot themselves in the foot. And not only did they shoot themselves in the foot in 2008 and in 2014, they shot themselves in the foot because Morena in the last Congress proposed an electoral reform which would have gotten rid of the overrepresentation clause, and they opposed the electoral reform and took it to the courts. So they shot themselves in the foot a third time. You're running out of toes.
Yeah, and I think this graphic here really lays it out really clearly. All of those voices that now are talking about this being somehow unconstitutional or illegal or unethical, because we've seen some of that language as well, or that it violates the spirit of the Constitution, are the same voices who had nothing to say previously, right? This isn't all the way it's been done since 2009 and in 2012 and 15, et cetera, et cetera. This is the way it's been done. And any attempt to change that more recently was rejected, as you said. And so therefore, the only conclusion you can arrive to is that those trying to characterize this as some kind of unethical, illegal, unconstitutional action is actually, they themselves are the ones who are trying to perpetrate what is essentially a fraud, to try to rob the government, the elected bodies, of the actual representation that voters gave to the Congress. That's it, right?
That's it.
That's how democracies work. Democracy, voters go out, they vote, they, according to the system, the rules are laid out. In fact, there's actually laws that say you can't change the electoral system within a certain window of time, so that everybody's in agreement. Everybody's on the same page. They understand what the rules are. These were the rules. If they had an issue with it, they should have brought it up way beforehand. But no, they didn't think it was going to happen. They didn't think that there was going to be a plan C. This is all actually about the reforms. What are the reforms about? As we've talked about previously on this program, it's about unseating the conservatives from their strongholds. They are taking refuge in the judicial branch. They are using the judicial branch to impede Morena's progressive agenda, and they're trying to use that in order to secure what they couldn't at the ballot box, right? We have to emphasize that. The undemocratic actors in this picture are actually the opposition, the conservatives, who are trying to keep it from happening. And so, we'll see the way how the Electoral Tribunal determines this, right? Ultimately, this is in the hands of other administrative bodies, but it is important to pay attention, right? And I just wanted to kind of emphasize this, how much this is an image from the lower house of Congress back after the 2012 election, when the the coalitions looked quite different, right? But we had Compromiso por México, which is essentially the parties that backed the Pacto por México, but then later subsequently joined by the PRD, showing just, if there was overrepresentation, it would have been reflected here as well. But because they were in charge, they had nothing to say at the time, right? But now Morena and its allies do, because they're trying to advance an agenda. And I think another thing that is really telling about this is, who are the people who are talking about this being somehow an issue? Well, none other than Mexicanos contra la Corrupción y la Impunidad, Mexicans Against Corruption and Impunity.
Look at them again. US
NGO,
funded. Yep.
USAID funded, absolutely. Group belonging to essentially Claudia X Gonzalez. He's no longer the head of the institute, but everybody knows it has everything to do with him. And then his corrupt, or allegedly corrupt, successor, Maria Amparo Casar, who's going around and giving lectures about ethics when she's the one collecting a pension from Pemex that she's not entitled to. But here you have it, right? I'm not going to play the video. You know who she is. We've talked about her before. We all know what Mexicanos contra la Corrupción are about.
Yep.
Those are the people who are harping on this issue. Gee, what a surprise. I think that's telling. And then what else? Look at this. Guadalupe Acosta Naranjo, who is the head of this other fake AstroTurf organization, Frente Cívico Nacional, National Civic Front, which purports to represent, exactly, ex-PRD basically, and they're flirting with becoming a political party. Go ahead if you want. Sure, it's a lot of work. Yeah, I don't think it's going to change anything for the opposition, but maybe they need a new face. But anyway, now to this point, right? Now they're calling for a massive demonstration against the overrepresentation in the legislative branch, with the race fist, the same kind of language in front of the INE.
Oh, well,
I thought el INE no se toca.
I thought, yes. Didn't they have 3 marches all dressed in pink and slathering on their suntan lotion and their hats and the brunch and the signs, all to convince Mexicans that you can't touch the INE, respect the INE, respect the autonomy of the INE. The INE is the guarantor of democracy, the Atlantic, and all these people. And oh my God, now look at them. Now look at them. Now they're out there. They're going to be out in front of the INE trying to pressure the INE. Touching the INE, which is what they said you can't do. Why don't you just respect the INE and the INE no se toca? My God. My God. So now they're trying to pressure the INE. A couple more points here. This is simply an extension of lawfare, which we've talked about in the program, and it's very important, right? Lawfare is the way to get around democratic and accountable mechanisms by gumming up everything in the courts, right? Trying to change what you can't change by democracy through the courts and through legal action. This is just an electoral extension of lawfare, which has been, carried across Latin America and across the world, right? Why is this important? Because very specifically, we'll just be very, very concise about it. If you apply the overrepresentation clause to parties, to individual parties, in this case, the coalition of Morena, Workers' Party, and Green Party, they get to the 2/3 majority. Yeah. If you apply the overrepresentation clause to the coalition as a whole, they don't. Mm-hmm. They fall just short. And this is the crux of the matter. They don't want them to get to the 2/3 majority, so they can't pass constitutional level reforms, starting with the judicial reform, which is going to attack, this monstrously corrupt system and clean out the Supreme Court. Clean out the Supreme Court. Clean out the federal court systems. This is what they're trying to avoid at all costs, and this is why they're trying to create this big fuss about overrepresentation. One final point, which is interesting, and Temeris Greco mentions this in his article in Milenio, and actually Noronha's talked about this quite a bit, right? If Mexico had a first-past-the-post system like the United States or like Great Britain, right, where the Labor Party recently won a 450-seat landslide on 34% of the vote, if Mexico had a first-past-the-post system like these great number A-grade qualified democracies in The Economist, Morena would have won 86% of the seats in the House of Representatives, House of Deputies, and 94% of the Senators' seats. right? If it were a system like the US and the UK, right, which is supposedly full democracies in the
Consolidated.
Economist ranking, full democracies, right? 86% of the House and 94% of the Senate, right? Actually, the minority representation rules did guarantee that the opposition got a lot more seats than they would otherwise if it had just been seat by seat by seat or district by district by district, right? So there you are. There you are. It's going to be difficult for the opposition to prevail in this in the face of a 32-point defeat, but never discount the kind of what we call chanchullos they can try to invent at the electoral tribunal. Right? They've already come out attacking López Obrador and the Mañanera and said that because AMLO made an offhand comment about the social programs in the Mañanera, all of a sudden now the social programs as a whole, violated the balance of the election. Right? That's as if a politician in the U.S. were to say, we can't get rid of Social Security. They say, oh no, now you violated the equitability of the election because you talked about a social program. Or you talked about Medicare. Right? So this is something to keep watching. Their last ditch effort to try to claw back seats from the victorious coalition, again through judicial means.
Absolutely. And I would, if I had the advice for them, I would say, be careful. You're playing with fire. I mean, if they really do try to push for that, if they really try to go against the will of the voters, the result will be worse for them, right? Worst case scenario, they annul the election. There's a new election. Claudia runs again. She wins not by 59% of the vote. She wins 80% of the vote. You'll see. Absolutely. Without a doubt. And I'm glad you talked about social programs because that actually brings us to our next topic. Marco Cortés, once again, saying the quiet part out loud. So we have this clip here. I'm going to actually go ahead and play it with audio.
Para los programas sociales, me estoy incluyendo, ¿eh? Es quien da más. El PAN tiene 4 principios fundamentales: bien común, persona humana, solidaridad y subsidiariedad. El de la subsidiariedad es enseña a pescar. No des el pescado permanentemente y caímos en la subasta. ¿Quién da más programas sociales? ¿Quién le pone más a los adultos mayores? ¿Quién sube esto? Y la pregunta es, ¿y la diferenciación? ¿No logramos que la gente viera un proyecto distinto del que nos está gobernando? Y de hecho, terminamos avalando, fíjate, esto es súper importante, terminamos avalando una política clientelar, adormecedora, que no impulsa el crecimiento, que no impulsa que la gente salga adelante, sino que la mantiene en su estatus pobre. No logramos impulsarlos y no logramos decirle a la gente, no, nuestro proyecto se llama generar condiciones de inversión, de trabajo, de desarrollo y de darte a ti las herramientas para que salgas adelante y no solo del asistencialismo.
So,
wow.
For our listeners who don't speak Spanish or don't understand Spanish, basically what he says, we fell into the trap of defending the social programs. We didn't stick to our principles, which talks about, basically the pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. We'll give you supports. Teach a man. He literally gives that classic right-wing trope, right? Teach a man to fish and he eats for several days, as opposed to giving a man a fish and he eats for a day. That's quite literally what he says there, talking about how that's their priorities, and we fell into this trap. And what this is actually is clientelist programs that don't lift people out of poverty. All it does is keep them poor, and that what they look is to generate conditions for investment. So basically, what you expect to hear from neoliberals. But here's the funny part: they went on an all-out campaign to say you're not allowed to talk about social programs because we support them. You're not allowed to say that we would get rid of them because we wouldn't. You're liars. They even made those fake billboards pretending like the INE was the one saying that social programs are untouchable, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, now we're past the election. No need to lie to the population anymore. The truth comes out. And this is what we've been saying all along. And fortunately, the population was wiser and knew these guys are lying. Xochitl Gálvez is lying to me. When they say they support social programs, historically, they never have. They never implemented them, not the way that López Obrador did. Therefore, I'm not going to be convinced by their argument claiming that they're actually going to strengthen them. The truth is there. PAN is a right-wing party. It's actually closer to the far right than it is to the center. And was never in favor of these programs. They tried this marketing strategy by running Xochitl Gálvez, trying to, play up her modest, humble backgrounds, all this kind of narrative, knowing that the population supports the public policies being implemented by Morena, the fourth transformation of Mexico. And so they had to lie. But now we have the truth. Now we see that they were lying all along, and it's coming right out of their own mouths.
Yeah, so my first comment is, watching that video again, is, why are you shouting? He's like 2 inches away from Rene Delgado. Why, like, how many extra caffeine jolts did he have that morning, right? You don't have to shout. Rene Delgado is right there. You have a microphone, right? You're mic'd up. We hear you. This is just, it's really been interesting to watch kind of the decline and fall of two of the most unsuccessful politicians in the history of Mexican politics, right? Marco Cortés and Alito Moreno, the head of the PAN and the PRI, respectively. When you lose that bad, as we've talked about before, shutting up is an option. Taking a break, take a vacation, or if you're at least honorable, resign. You lost, and you lost badly. Resign, right? Alito Moreno is trying to cling to power in the PRI desperately. All these people who said that López Obrador was going to change the constitution to reelect himself, and now it turns out that it's Alito Moreno from the PRI that wants to reelect himself, right? Looks like the PAN is going through some kind of process to elect a new leader. Yeah. So, it's really interesting that he calls the social programs adormecedores, sleep-inducing. Mm-hmm. Imagine that. He calls the social programs sleep-inducing, right? And client-based, when precisely they were set up as universal programs, not means-tested, so that everyone has a right to them, so that they're not, precisely they weren't client-based, mm-hmm. right? But during the campaign, as you mentioned, we had Xochitl Gálvez herself bringing up the social programs, and we're not going to get rid of the social programs, and we're not going to get rid of the social programs, and you're lying to say we're getting rid of the social programs, and going to the INE to try to gag people from saying that they were going to get rid of the social programs, saying that we're going to protect the social programs, right? All a total facade, all a total lie, and barely a month after the election, there you are. There you are, right? And it's interesting, just to close on this point, we've kind of speculated, where is the PAN going to go? Right? Mm-hmm. Where is the PAN going to go? After losing 2 landslide elections, and getting really whacked this time, right? Losing by 32 points, and even in coalition with the PRI, getting less than they had gotten, running separately in 2018 and all that. So there are kind of really 2 routes there, right? Are you going to kind of go to the center, which they tried, obviously, very falsely to do during the election, right? The Xochitl Gálvez saying she's going to protect the social programs and shalala, right? Or you're going to go back to their roots in the 1930s, right? Their roots in the kind of neo-phalangism, right? Neo-fascism of the 30s. And if what Marco said there is any indication, it looks like looks like the route they're flirting with at the moment, right? Going harder right, and perhaps to try to preempt a far right party, coming up on their right flank. So that remains to be seen. But the shouty Marco looks like they're going more far right than a kind of a Movimiento Ciudadano kind of buena ondita kind of fruitsy center right kind of opposition, right?
In fact, that's probably the most likely scenario, right? If history is any indication in Latin America, they tend to pivot towards to the right, try to even use unconstitutional insurrectionary strategies to return to power, but kind of giving a face of still wanting to participate in the democratic system. Movimiento Ciudadano is an interesting case, actually, now that you mentioned them, right? It's likely that they will occupy that kind of center-right space now, mm-hmm. because the center is basically starting to get abandoned. Because the PRI, we shouldn't believe them, but they've declared themselves enemies of neoliberalism, that they want to support progressive social programs and they want to support higher minimum wage and all this kind of stuff. Suddenly, they found that they're progressive credentials once again, or at least they're claiming to be. But of course, we didn't mention this, but it's interesting. Why would Alito Moreno want to stick around so long? I don't know if you saw his absolutely gigantic, heavily furnished, highly decorated mansion over in Campeche. just
The 300
extraordinary.
million
He claims
peso
it's worth
house.
9 million pesos, but some
Yeah.
people are saying it's actually probably closer to 300 million pesos.
Yep.
It's an absurd property. I mean, these people have a personal interest in retaining power because it allows them access to a lot of resources. And actually, that's worth bringing up for our last segment as well, right? People act like, a politician can be bought for $500,000. There's plenty of money in the Mexican political system that they don't actually need to go and run and find these drug cartels, organized crime groups to subsidize them. But I wanted to, before we move on to our final segment, to talk about the recent tweet here by Sergio Sarmiento that I mentioned at the beginning. So here's his interpretation of this graph. So this graph here, Latinometrics from the Reuters Institute, says Latin America loses faith in news. And we can see that this is a regional issue. It is a worldwide issue, basically starting since around the pandemic. Trust in media has severely declined, with the exception being the United States, but that's a very particular case. Anyway, as we can see, yes, trust in news is dropping generally throughout the world, certainly here in Mexico. But what's Sarmiento's conclusion from this? AMLO's constant attacks against the media have proven to be successful. The confidence of Mexicans in media has dropped dramatically from 60 to 35%, and then says from this. Now, that is a very interesting reading of this graph, because I think our friend Sarmiento is missing the point entirely. What do you think is really going on here? Why might there be less faith in the media as a result since basically 2018 when López Obrador came into office?
Yeah, well, I responded to the tweet saying, maybe the fact the Mexican media is controlled by a handful of tax-evading plutocrats that twist, distort, and lie at their convenience might have just something to do with it, right? Maybe his own boss at TV Azteca, Ricardo Salinas Pliego, right, who we've talked about in the program, might just have a little something to do with it. And his attack dog, Javier Alatorre, right, on the TV Azteca program, and all the manipulation of Televisa over the years, right? The Tigre Escarga saying that, Mexico is a jodido population and there'll always be jodido, right? Mexico is a screwed population. They will always be screwed. So you just got to, fill them up with cheap entertainment, right? And, tendentious news, right? That was the founder of Televisa. Mm-hmm. And that's been the philosophy that's governed quote unquote news in this country ever since television became a thing, right? Not to mention the print media, which, my God, every false headline, every tendentious story, right? Every bit of fake news. I mean, that's why, the Mañanera has become such an institution, right? Because there's never any lack of any of that to talk about. And Sarmiento has been a key point, a key linchpin in that, legitimating that system, profiting off of that system, basically becoming the image of that system. That's why it's Sarmiento, right? That's the joke about his name, right? Now, as you talked about, Jose Luis, this is an international phenomenon, right? It's right there on the chart, right? So does Sarmiento believe that faith in news is down in Germany because of AMLO also? Or in Brazil because of AMLO also? Wow. Así no, AMLO. I mean, AMLO has this incredible international reach. Did AMLO affect the faith in news in Argentina? Or is it because the Mexican press oligarchy is part of an international press oligarchy that protects the same exact interests and make people like Sarmiento with his red glasses and his, cute little suits very wealthy, wealthy people, right? Maybe that has something to do with it. Oh no. It's just AMLO, as if it was the Mexican public were so gullible that AMLO himself alone could change the entire public perception of the media. People can't come to their own judgments, Jose Luis.
Yeah. I mean, it's basically revealing Sarmiento's illiteracy when it comes to the issue. I really like this tweet from Mario Campa where he points it out. Here's a different graph showing between 2018 and 2024, 25 of 36 countries had a drop in their trust in the media. Like you said, is López Obrador responsible for it dropping in Canada, in Chile, Romania? Of course not. There is an overall.
The man's just a giant.
I mean, incredible. No wonder they're so scared of him.
Yeah.
What are these people going to do when he's gone? I mean, they are more obsessed with him than his own supporters. They're really going to have trouble.
They talk a lot more about him than, more consistently than we do. Yep.
Yeah. But anyway, the point is, I think the guy can't even read a graph. He comes to the wrong conclusion. And we know, like you said, Sarmiento. He's lying. He knows what he's trying to do. He's just distorting the fact. But we just saw at the very beginning of this program why these spaces are important. Because if we didn't have that mañanera, if we didn't have Luisa Maria Alcalde, if we didn't have Jesus Ramirez Cuevas, all giving this information, being like, actually, this is the way the elections have been done historically. This has been the way that we agreed to the rules beforehand. You can't change them after the fact. There's no such thing as over-representation the way that you're trying to fool people. You can write all of you want, or your articles and nexos if you want, but here you're going to at least get the counter-narrative, and millions of people tune in, and millions of people are informed and have a different perspective, providing that balance. Otherwise, we would have been inundated. And then, of course, the boomerang effect, right? That would have then been replicated in the foreign media, saying López Obrador and his party are behaving unconstitutionally and are trying to now secure more power than they actually earned at the ballot box, et cetera, et cetera. And then again, that would come back here and be laundered again. Oh, New York Times publishes reports saying, the State Department thinks it's unconstitutional, this kind of thing. That's the way it works.
And it's funny that you mentioned that too, because I conclude my most recent Jacobin article, right? The section at the bottom called Blackmail Inc., with a brief summary of some of the foreign media after Claudia won, right? One of them we talked about already, with the New York Times saying, Mexico's left won big, investors are worried. And they started trying to play up this idea that the peso had gone down, which it did temporarily, and then regained ground, right? CNN came out with the show, right, with Sicario saying, is Mexican democracy in peril? And of course, they interviewed Denise Dresser laughably, right? Politico with Lilabed. I'm just, this whole thing of, forget foreign investment if people think that there's not going to be, faith in law in Mexico and all this nonsense. But then the news cycle moved on. Right? And they didn't lay in like they have before. And I think that has a lot to do with the robustness of, institutions like the Mañanera and the YouTubers and social media and, a very politicized population, that they threw a few darts, right? Tried to play up, the fall of the peso over a couple of weeks, tried to play up the fall of the stock market, but then they kind of lost interest and moved on. For now, they'll be back, right? But this is what happens when you have a robust response system that doesn't believe these lies, like across countries, like we see here in the chart, right? The hits don't work as well. They don't work as well as they used to. And so they move on to another, meatier target or a weaker target that they think that they can dive into better.
Right. Although, in the case of Mexico, what we are seeing is a refry of the old story.
Oh, yes.
So we're going to end in this, and I think we're going to spend a little bit more time than we usually do on this segment, because I think it's important to break it down. One is a tribute to the fact that this is actually one of the reasons we decided to start this podcast, was that we were so bothered by the coverage. And then these kind of, you called it the 3-act play, right? The 1, 2, 3 punch of basically ahead of the election, trying to set a narrative that Morena, López Obrador, and Claudia Sheinbaum were somehow narco candidates. That there was this tweet storm campaign, these Twitter bot campaigns. It was revealed to be artificially manipulated trending topics, trying to suggest a link between organized crime groups and Morena and the candidate, and Claudia Sheinbaum in particular. In fact, the INE did issue a fine, I believe, in the case of Xochitl Gálvez for using the term narco candidata or narco candidate in reference to Claudia Sheinbaum. But it was obviously a strategy. There was a strategy that was thought up long before the election period officially started to try to set this as the narrative. And part of that strategy involved what we saw play out. Stories in Inside Crime, stories in Deutsche Welle, stories in the New York Times, and stories in ProPublica, which again does some good work, but they are really ruining their reputation with their insistence on this. Again, we covered this in, I believe it was episode 0 and episode 1.
That's how we started this, as you're saying.
Yeah. Going after López Obrador with basically Nothing. You know, their golden boy, Tim Golden, has come back with basically yet another nothing burger. Incredible. So here's the headline. Drug traffickers said they backed an early campaign of Mexico's president, but U.S. agents were done investigating. Documents and interviews show that Mexican traffickers extradited to the U.S. continued to tell of drug money sent to President Andrés Manuel López Obrador's 2006 campaign, but those allegations were not pursued. And I'll just read a little bit more. This was posted July 19th of the lead. When the Justice Department shut down a secret inquiry into the allegations that drug traffickers had funded the first presidential campaign of Mexico's leader, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, officials in Washington closed the case forcefully. Over the years that followed in that 2011 decision, U.S. law enforcement agencies continued to hear similar reports, including accounts from at least 4 high-level Mexican drug traffickers who said that their gangs helped to fund López Obrador's political machine in return for promises of government protection. Documents and interviews show. But U.S. investigators did not pursue those claims, in part because they saw little support in Washington for a corruption case against an important Mexican political leader, current and former officials said. And I'll end with this last graph. Quote, "We took our best shot, and they didn't want to do the case," end quote. One former investigator for the Drug Enforcement Agency said of the 18-month inquiry into López Obrador's 2006 campaign, quote, "That was it. Nobody had any appetite to push it forward," end quote. Now, where to begin? I mean, it's quite extraordinary, and in fact, journalistically, quite dishonest what Tim Golden is doing here. This man supposedly won a Pulitzer, supposedly the best prize in journalism, and he's committing grave faults. That, I'm going to say it out the outright. This is racist to me. The fact that this is happening is underpinned by racism. Of course, those brown idiots down south are easily bought and sold. They don't have any political principles. They're willing to get into bed with organized crime groups. They are so dishonest down there. This is the only thing that makes sense to me. So I'm going to continue to publish stories that are irresponsibly sourced and that have no actual verification because I think less of those people. It is racist. But anyway, to get into this, right? This idea, government and interviews show. Documents and interviews show. You know what those documents are? They're just the reports by the same DEA officials and officers who are interested in pursuing this case based on what? The allegations that are made by desperate individuals from organized crime groups who are seeking to make a deal. There's nothing else to it. There is nothing else to substantiate. When you talk about documents, I think he's trying to pull a fast one on us. Yeah. I think he's trying to make it seem like there's actually more to it. But they're just reports from the same dishonest DEA that has a bone to pick with López Obrador, that viewed him as an enemy in 2006, that worked to stop him in 2012, that were upset with all the government decisions that he made starting from 2018. The DEA has it out for López Obrador. They are not these wholesome police officers who are just trying to keep drugs out of the neighborhoods of the white kids in the United States. That's not what the DEA
That's what Naco believes too, huh?
That apparently so. Yeah. Nakhla, also, we talked about that last time, using this source. The DEA is not a reliable source. People, we know what they've done. How many more reports do we need about the unscrupulous behavior of the DEA throughout Latin America in particular? It is an extension of U.S. foreign policy. Everything the DEA does is about advancing the interests of U.S. capital and the owners of capital. And yet, we see it time and time again. There is literally nothing else. The only other source here is Anabel Hernandez, who's even worse when it comes to the sourcing. All she does is have anonymous sources. You're allowed to use them. You don't have to reveal them, but you have to have more. You have to have corroborating evidence. You know, well, I was told this, and then I looked it up, and it coincided with this, and therefore I can conclude. That is not present in any of this. The single source of this is organized crime group actors trying to get a deal desperately. And you made a great comment about this, which is like, hold on, let me go back home and get the evidence. I swear I have proof that López Obrador is a narco candidate. Don't you want this proof? You gotta be kidding me.
So on top of what you've just laid out, right, which is the same thing that happened in the first piece, and then the editor had to come out to try to defend the first piece, and then just confuse the issue more because he just got the facts wrong. Right. And then, López Obrador has interestingly come out with a series of questions for Golden, saying, was this your idea or did somebody give it to you? Right. Payment, documents, sources. Right. Who in the DEA told you this? All the same questions we have. Right. And he said, if Tim Golden answers these questions, I'll give him an interview. So there you are.
Balls in your court, Tim.
Yeah, balls in
There
your
you go,
court.
Tim. In fact, they said, you don't have to give us sources. We get it. But who in the DG, were they lower ranking? Were they middle? Did it come from the top? Who gave you the story? Where did it come from? What was your thinking behind this? I thought that was a great response, that letter saying like, here's a series of questions. Because I think if he answers those questions, we will come to know the truth, that this is actually part of the coordinated campaign. Right? Maybe Tim's a patsy. Maybe Tim's like, well, I'll write this report. I'll get paid for it. They do ask him, how much were you paid? I'll get paid for it. I can use my prestige. I can seem like I'm a cutting edge journalist writing about the tough issues in Latin America and organized crime and blah, 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 right? Trying to play up his own reputation that maybe doesn't even deserve anymore, right? Like, what does the Pulitzer mean anymore when people who win it write garbage like this?
And a little bit farther down in the piece, he talks about how El Grande, Sergio Villarreal Barragan, right, contends that he delivered money to López Obrador in 2006. And he told this to the DEA shortly after his arrest in September of 2010, right? But then it says, a previously unpublished DEA report, reviewed by ProPublica, makes no mention of that assertion. The two agents' report of investigation, dated September 20th, quotes the trafficker as saying he was interested in cooperating with the U.S. government and would be able to provide valuable information on high-ranking Mexican government officials, but didn't say anything about AMLO. So if you then go down, it says, several former officials said that it was not uncommon for American law enforcement agents in Mexico to edit out allegations of high-level corruption from reports. So what are we talking about here? What are we talking about here? I mean, seriously, what are we talking about here? El Grande is arrested and talks to them on September 12th. They file a report a week later on September 20th that makes no mention of the fact that he had said that he had given money to López Obrador. No mention of it. And then the only recourse they have is to say, well, maybe they edited it out. What kind of speculative journalism is this? The same DEA report a week later mentions nothing about it. And so they have to get to the point of saying, well, maybe it wasn't there and somebody got rid of it. Okay. Well, maybe it put in there that I'm 7 feet tall and I'm going to play for the Knicks next year. Maybe they took that out. What the hell are we talking about? I mean, this is straw grasping. This is just, excuse me. This is just grasping at straws. And the whole piece is like this, right? They said, La Barbie was supposed to have said something, but then it didn't pan out. And then Jesus Zambada had said that, that there was some kind of connection, but then he refused, as we know, in the Garcia Luna trial. He said that never happened, right? And, and on and on and on. He's had 6 months to work on this since the original piece.
Oh, 6 months. He gave López Obrador less than a day to respond. Right. He's got 6 months, but then the day before he's going to publish, he sends this letter.
Right.
I mean, come on. You also, again, this is why I think it's underpinned by at least a degree of racism. Yeah. Who are you to demand that of the largest Spanish-speaking country, a member of the North American relationship, right? The president of Mexico. Who are you, Tim, to demand that he answer you immediately in that way?
And also laying down conditions. He said, he told Jesus, I want you to answer me personally and not in another forum. In other words, don't bring this to the Mañanera.
Right.
Right?
Well, too bad.
Sorry, you don't get to set the conditions. You don't get to set the conditions. Sorry.
Who do you think you are? Surely he just thinks less of Mexico and Mexicans and the president. Listen, I've had many issues with many Mexican presidents, but the institution is there and demands a certain degree of some respect. I don't care who you are. I don't care who you write for. I don't care how many wars you won. Right? That's just not the way that things work. And I'm certain he wouldn't do it if it was, what's his name, Keir Starmer, right? Or Emmanuel Macron.
Of course not. Of course not.
Right?
Of course.
And here's the other thing. So I stopped here because, of course, right? Look who's on the screen. Look who's part of the environment where this is being published. Genaro Garcia Luna. So allegedly, this investigation by the DEA, this 18-month investigation, is taking place when that man who's on the screen is in charge of security policy in Mexico. The man who is in jail today, prison, in the United States because of his ties to organized crime groups. So Felipe Calderon, who won by fraud, has his right-hand man when it comes to security policy, coordinating, cooperating, being involved with organized crime groups. Meanwhile, the DEA is investigating Calderon's number one political opponent in the country, right? People don't remember 2006 was still a very tense moment where these were the two most important political actors in the country. And Felipe Calderon detests López Obrador. He detests him. He hates him with a visceral hate. And of course, the DEA is investigating López Obrador, Calderon's opponent. Meanwhile, Calderon's police chief is in there messing closely with organized crime groups. It's absolutely inconceivable. DEA, if that's true, you were looking in the wrong place. You should have been investigating that guy, but you were too busy doing political favors for Calderon.
Absolutely right.
Trying to make up a case. And again, I want to insist this.
And trying to set up yet another progressive Latin American leader.
Yeah, exactly. Right. I mean, if Alito Moreno can have a luxurious mansion with foreign art and all kinds of luxurious details, it's because he's stealing money from the public money that is given to political parties, right? Allegedly. There's no proof of it, but it doesn't match up. His income and his properties don't match up. So to think that López Obrador, some kind of backwoods political leader, would personally go and pick up a suitcase full of $500,000 is absurd on the surface of it and racist if you just scratch a little bit.
And, it's interesting, too, that obviously they were stung by the criticism, right? Because ProPublica, considers themselves to be the great, investigative public service, publication, right?
Yep.
You're obviously stung by, our criticism of others, AMLO, that showed how hollow their original piece was, right? This is why, the editor had to come out, right? Engelberg, and, try to save the piece, right? Unsuccessfully, right? And they spent 6 more months on this. 6 more months on this. And how much more money, right? After it had been clear that their piece had been part of an international operation against AMLO in the election, using, bots and troll farms and millions of dollars, right, to, emphasize narco AMLO, narco Claudia, narco this, narco that, with, paid bots and farms coming in from different Latin American countries and Spain. That might have been something that would have investigated well. Interesting how their piece was used, with or without their, their knowledge of it. But they had 6 months. And they come back with unnamed sources. They come back with El Grande said this, but the report didn't mention it a week later. They come back with La Barbie said this, but then not. Then they came back with Zambada said this and then that. Zambada, sorry.
Mm-hmm.
That's all you got?
That's it.
So as they said in the Mañanera, what's the story? That one person was maybe going to be hired in the Attorney General's office that then wasn't hired there?
And that's it.
Soto? I mean, is that worth all of this? Is that worth running your reputation through the mud? Is it worth it? So it goes back to the questions. Who's behind this? Who's, promoting it? How much were you paid? Whose idea was it? Where are the sources coming from? Because there certainly isn't enough in the actual documentary evidence to justify this many pieces on it. There just isn't.
And that's why we see previously, right? People are losing faith in even these institutions, nonprofit newsrooms like ProPublica. People need to do a better job. You're dealing with a very educated populace. And I noticed that they publish this in Spanish as well. So anybody in Mexico who doesn't read English can also go ahead and check it out and see the lies for themselves. It's right there. Leer en español. It's available if you want. Check it out. Come to your own conclusions. I think you won't be surprised to find that you realize the same thing we have here. This is part of a smear campaign. Now this appears to be, like you said, an effort to kind of try to save face, try to make it seem like there actually was more to this story. But once again, even the letter that he sent to López Obrador admits it. Once again, there is no actual investigation. Nothing was ever uncovered. Everything was closed. There's nothing to it. There's no story here. That brings us to an end of another episode of Soberania. I'm glad we spent some extra time on that one. Sometimes we leave losers and haters for the end and we run out of time. So I'm glad we were able to spend some time because that one's really what's worth it, right? Like, and we mentioned also, the role of the YouTubers, right? The Mañanera, the different kinds of means of communication. So we're always really grateful for people tuning into us. We're doing our best to bring you this information, to fill that niche to the English-speaking audience who wants to know more about Mexico, wants to have an informed and unbiased take that where we, share with you our understanding of things happening here. As always, if you like the program, like and subscribe, share with your friends. Word of mouth is a great way to get the message out there. Send it with your friends and neighbors, especially those of you living in the United States. There's a lot of information that perhaps doesn't make it to you. The media environment in the United States is a bit different than here in Mexico. So thank you so much for joining us. Kurt, any parting words?
No, as you say, like and subscribe, and we'll see you again for another episode of Soberania.